much, Andrew Patterson, for giving us an insight into the alternatives that the internet offers in bringing them into sharper focus than some of us old Luddites would otherwise have been aware of, and that's been worthwhile. Now, our final speaker in the panel is Elena Jeffries. Elena Jeffries is a 37-year-old child of an Italian migrant mother and an Anglo father of colonial heritage. Elena will be speaking on behalf of Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Workers Association. Elena's sex work background includes full-service brothel work, private work and street-based sex work with clients of all abilities, stripping amateur porn, sex worker, peer education, advocacy and activism for the last 15 years in Australia, publishing widely on topics including HIV and criminalisation, censorship, trafficking and feminism. Scarlet Alliance is the peak body for sex workers and sex worker organisations formed in Australia in 1989 and delivering over 20,000 occasions of service annually for sex workers in Australia. So welcome Elena Jeffries, please.
Hello everyone, and clearly I'm in good company. I too am a student of cultural studies and political theory as my major. I was at university in the early 90s, and in 1993 I was on the committee for the Student Guild at UWA when the University Computer Club on that campus had already been illegally hacking into the local area network of UWA, which was the only internet network in Western Australia of that size at that time. We already had an advanced internet network within our building, but we had to pretend we didn't because we didn't have permission from the state government to have one. So that is just one small example of how regulations, arbitrary regulations are used in many ways, but whether or not things actually follow regulations is another question, and that's going to be the theme of what I'm raising today. I'd also like to point out that the word youth is troubling in its generalisation. At 14 years old, you can work in Australia. At 16 years old, you can have sex in Australia. At 18 years old, you can do sex work in Australia. And at 18 years old, you can have a vote in Australia. At what point do we determine youth? And I must raise this also in the context of the work that we do in developing countries, because the term youth can be used for people, 30 and under, for anyone unmarried, and again, very arbitrary. Scarlet Alliance is a national peak body of sex workers and sex worker organisations in Australia, supports everyone who works in the sex industry to work how and where they choose to work. This includes the controversial areas that infringe upon public morality, such as street-present sex workers, and we support the right of street-based sex workers. It includes the right of migrant workers, that is people from other countries, to be able to come here to work. It includes the rights of peoples of all sex and gender diversity to work, and it also includes internet sex work. When we speak, we don't speak on behalf of ourselves as individual sex workers, but rather we draw on the broad service delivery framework that we are engaged in Australia. We use an evidence-based approach, and the approaches, those approaches mean that when we speak, we are speaking with the full knowledge that our information and the things that we are sharing publicly come from reliable sources. In Australia, I've done some cultural studies and I've published in a few different cultural studies journals about sex workers' uptake of technology. It is clear in Australia that sex workers are quicker to uptake technology than other occupations. For example, mobile phones were pretty much driven in Australia. The sales of mobile phones, sex workers were using mobile phones from the very first moment they're available in the market. Condoms are another example. A survey in 1991 by Roberta Perkins of private sex workers here in New South Wales, condom use in 1991 was just over 90% among sex workers at that time. A survey by Clio same year of women who were sexually active of the same demographic and same age background showed only a 40% uptake of condoms. So that gives you an example of how sex work is very quick to uptake technology, and the internet is no different. In New South Wales, we have decriminalisation of sex work. It was found through the Woods Royal Commission that police involvement in sex work led to police corruption and led to a role of police being the regulators of sex work, which was inappropriate because the police should be the protectors of sex work, not put in a role of prosecutors. When decriminalisation got bipartisan support in 1995 here in New South Wales, all of the criminal sanctions against sex workers, except for one, were removed. Once those criminal sanctions against sex workers were removed and police were removed from our lives, what that meant was that sex workers were free to be able to be regulated just like any other job. Regulated by tax regulation, locational and planning regulation, occupational health and safety regulation, amenity impact regulations, fire regulations, all of the things that any other business is able to be regulated by. But there was one law that they could not receive bipartisan agreement to remove or strike from the books, and I wonder if any of you know what it is. In New South Wales, it is a criminal offence to advertise yourself as a sex worker. That's right. Every newspaper that you open that has advertisements in it, all of our internet advertising, every magazine that we advertise in, it's technically illegal because there could not be reached political agreement that advertising wasn't socially detrimental to our youth. So that was the reason why it's still criminal in New South Wales to do all those things. How is that possible, do you say? Because we have been advertising non-stop since before 1995 and since 1995. And that is because it is a law that is unprosecuted, and even though it is on the books, advertising is tolerated in New South Wales. So I'm going to return to this theme about the class of regulators, those people who have to sit in a room and make decisions about regulation, and how those decisions, while may seem moral and lofty at the time, may actually eventually be impossible to impose. They may be chosen not to impose, or they may be so ludicrous that simply no one follows them, not even the police. The ability to advertise as a sex worker in Australia is one of the last bastions of our human rights. It is an area that attracts a lot of political difficulty. Regulation of sex workers' communication attracts a lot of attention. And I'm going to give you some examples: Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, and I'm going to return to Queensland in more detail towards the end of the talk. In Queensland, you are allowed to describe yourself in your advertising, but you're not allowed to describe the services you offer. You are not permitted by law to describe your age in any of your advertising in Queensland. In Victoria, you're not allowed to advertise at all unless you put a number which is linked to your registration number, which is held by a central regulatory body, which has been, unfortunately, accessible to different government departments and different people, which is in no way a private process. What that means is that individuals, every time they advertise, take the risk of their address, their tax file number, and all of their private information being linked back to their sex worker status, which can be very dangerous in a state where sex workers are not covered by anti-discrimination law. And in New South Wales, as I explained, advertising for sex work is totally illegal. So now to return to the question of regulation and whether or not internet is a challenge to youth. Well, if you use the example of sex work, it is more of a challenge to the regulators than it is to those who are trying to get around the regulation. The overwhelming need within the regulatory classes to control what is generally not understood creates a huge amount of regulation which may be impossible to impose. Are regulators of the internet the young people that we speak of? No. Are regulators of the internet having their own behaviour regulated? No. What is it then that drives that regulatory class? I would concur with my colleague Andrew that moral panic, sex panic, the veneer of having some control over communication and communication methods leads governments to produce unnecessary laws that impede everybody, adults, young people, and everybody, whether it be on the internet, in the newspaper, or through other forms of communication. Why is it important that sex workers are able to explicitly share information about ourselves and our sexual services to our clients, whether it be on the internet or in print media? Well, it's important that when I advertise to clients, that I'm able to accurately describe who I am. What is my age? What do I look like? What are the services I provide? What are my prices? What hours can you come and see me? What kind of telephone calls will I take? Will I take emails? Will I answer blocked or unblocked numbers on my mobile phone? These are all the kinds of things that we enjoy to be able to describe to our clients before interaction takes place. It's a form of occupational health and safety. And being able to talk openly to my clients, to find out from my clients what are the prices they were thinking of, what are the services they are looking for, what are their needs, are they differently abled, is accessibility an issue, what are their expectations, what are their fantasies. These discussions to be able to happen either on the phone, verbally, or via internet are vital to running a sex work business so that by the time we actually get to the point of meeting or exchanging money and actually having sex together, we both have a really fair idea of what each other's expectations are. So now I'll return to Queensland and describe how the laws around communication impede this vital occupational health and safety measure. In Queensland, as part of the moral sex panic around sex work, unprotected sex with a sex worker is a criminal act in that state. The police, in order to regulate this, for many years posed as clients, asked sex workers for unprotected sex, and if the sex worker said yes, then the police officer would pull out their badge, call the rest of their team in, and arrest them. And I don't want you to think this is an unregulated area. For the last 10 years, at least one sex worker a week in Queensland is charged with crimes against the Prostitution Act. One sex worker a week. They've got an entire task force, and all they do is pretend to be clients and ring people up and harass them about their sexual activities over the phone. Now, one male street-based sex worker, about 4 years ago, took the police officer to task and pled not guilty. The police officer had posed as a client, picked up the young person in his car, said to the young person, I want to, let's organise sex, and will you give me oral sex without a condom? When the young person negotiated a price and said yes, the police officer pulled out his badge and charged him. But by the time it got to court, it was very clear that the police were on the wrong foot, because actually no oral sex unprotected had taken place. No crime had taken place. And this was the first person in almost 5 years who had pled not guilty, because this was the first person who was brave enough to put their name on record. Because all the other sex workers before this person had just pled guilty so that they didn't have to make a scene, and they didn't want a high profile because it would negatively affect their privacy and confidentiality. In this case, the young man did get off because actually the interaction had never taken place. All they'd done was talk about it. Well, Anna Bligh couldn't have that. Within 3 weeks, they had changed the law to criminalise discussing unprotected sex in Queensland. Now police have the right to prosecute you for simply the verbal or written or the online communication of the discussion about unprotected sex. Now I'm going to get a bit explicit here, just so that you know what this really means. This means that sex workers who talk about services such as oral sex without a condom on their blog can be charged with the criminal offence of discussing unprotected sex as a sex worker, and sex workers have been charged with that. This means that police can pose as clients and ring you up over the phone 100 times in a row if they like and harass you to agree to cunnilingus without a dam. Now, for many of you who've probably never heard of dental dams, they are a thin piece of latex that is used for protection for cunnilingus, protection for other sexual activities, and they're really only used in the sex industry. They're not common outside of sex work. Recently, like a year ago, some police in North Queensland rang up a group of migrant workers, Chinese-speaking workers, and according to the police, they managed to get Chinese-speaking background workers with low-level English to agree to cunnilingus without a dental dam over the phone. The sex workers are absolutely convinced that nothing like that was discussed on the phone. Absolutely convinced. Yet their command of English was not good. They were confused, and also they didn't want to make a scene, and they didn't want to have anything that might impact on their privacy and confidentiality, so they just pled guilty to it. Now, what does this mean? This means when we bring in laws that have political frameworks and no basis in any evidence, somebody has to regulate them, and the person that is regulating them is the police. If you bring in a criminal law, they have to regulate it. And how is it regulated in the sex industry? It's regulated through entrapment, with police posing as a person who wants a service that is technically illegal and will harass sex workers in order to get their one sex worker a week through the courts. This is the outcome of the regulatory class sitting in a room designing laws that are totally unworkable. For example, police going online pretending that they're young to entrap a pedophile, supposed pedophile. For example, police posing as clients to go to people's homes or to go to sex workers on the street, places like South Australia, places like Queensland, where some of those activities are illegal, in order to convince another person to agree for sex for money only to arrest them. This is incredibly problematic because it puts people who are absolutely untrained in anything to do with sexual health, sex work, industrial relations, or occupational health and safety as the entire beginning, middle and end of the regulation that we as sex workers face. Where will this end? Maybe the AFP will go and, I don't know, make some porn in order to entrap some porn viewers. And knowing the degree of entrapment that police, the degree that police rely on entrapment, I actually wouldn't put it past the AFP to invest in that kind of thing. Look, I want to finish by saying decriminalisation has worked really well in New South Wales, regardless of the unused criminal law that says that advertising is illegal in New South Wales. Being regulated by existing industrial relations law, health and safety law, locational regulations, taxation law, amenity impact law is something that we sex workers have fought for the right for. When we are criminalised and when we're regulated by the police, it takes us a step away from all the other regulations that people like yourselves enjoy. And I can't finish without just a response as well to the things that Helen has mentioned. People that Helen has mentioned, Rebecca Wisner, Gail Dines, Melinda Tankard-Reist, Sheila Jeffries. You didn't mention her, but I'm going to mention her as a kind of grandmother of it all. That these theorists don't support the decriminalisation of sex work and rather do support police regulating our industry. The regulatory classes are described by Laura Augustin in her book Sex at the Margins, and I recommend everybody should read it, as emerging from first wave feminism. That is, the push for abolition, the push for welfare, and the push to become involved in regulation was what got upper middle class women out of their kitchens in order to regulate working class women in theirs. This historic location of regulation within the feminist movement is continuing to play out now. Those advocates for the regulation and abolition of pornography are not the people who are working in pornography. And we would go as far as to say that, concur with Laura Augustin, that those academics in many ways are actually working, making money off our backs. When Gail Dines put her book together, and it was all about anti-porn, what was on the front? Well, it was a massive fetish shoe, kind of like the one I wear for work. So she was actually selling the book, the eroticisation of porn as something above and beyond and negative and hardcore and all of these things is actually part of the draw card to these arguments and is many abolitionists' wet dream. Searching for and finding for supposedly more hardcore porn. I mean, you know, we've all had the Fred Niles office, oh, we were doing research. It's like, well, you were just looking at it like everybody else. There is no justification for the criminalisation of sex work or pornography. And I would challenge anybody who says that porn is getting more hardcore by the day to please read Marquis de Sade. And please, if you can find anything in mainstream porn that's as hardcore as that, then I'll eat my words. Because there is absolutely nothing that is getting produced that's as hardcore as that pornography that was produced hundreds of years ago. It was pre-internet, no one had to take it to a cashier, a friend gave it to you. We've heard from Helen that people learn about sex on the internet. People also learn about democracy on the internet. People learn about the global financial crisis on the internet. If parents don't talk about these things with their kids, then their only source of information will be the internet. So my message is, we don't want to blame the content for what is actually just another form of communication, a form of communication that many people are using very well and that we rely on very heavily. Any censorship of explicit discussion about sex on the internet is going to have a negative impact on the occupation, health and safety of the sex industry, must be considered, and sex workers must be seen as the key stakeholders, not the regulatory classes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena Jeffries. I always suspected that Queensland was somehow different. Now I know it. Thank you for that interesting insight. Now, we're going to take questions. Now, there's just one announcement I want to make. The next forum in this series, which will be number 19 in the Roundtable series, will be here in this room on Tuesday the 22nd of November at 6 p.m. You might have one of these if you like, just to remind you. Topic, the future of the left. That's a very, very long bow we're drawing. The future of the left, and you'll be fascinated by that. So do come. That's on the 22nd of November. Now, I'm going to invite questions